Oh, we're live streaming this.
Yeah, we're doing a combination of multiple different things today. All right. Welcome back to Boss Uncaged podcast. So today, his government name is Kevin, but as you guys know, I like to give everyone I'm interviewing a particular nickname, and his nickname is going to kind of unfold like an onion with multiple layers. So his nickname is going to be the Inner Circle Boss, which should put a little smirk, a little smile on his face, because it really identifies his company about what we're talking about, but also he's really talking about more so like the inner circle of people's behavior and how does that really coincide in the world today. And again, I know that's kind of convoluted and you're probably scratching your heads, but I assure you, by the time this episode is done, the Inner Circle Boss is going to resonate with every listener that's listening right now. So the floor is yours, Kevin. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about you and what would you like to talk about today?
Well, thank you for that nickname. I have not been called that before, so that's really exciting. I'm glad to be here. This is going to be fun because I don't know where it's going to go. What would I like people to know about me? Man, I can be a little bit all over the place. I have a lot of different interests, but I certainly don't know everything about everything.
Mhm.
But the topics that I have dug into, I feel like I know them really well. And those could be topics like innovation and spinal implant development. It could be backpacking. It could be triathlon. It could be behavior, emotional health. So yeah, it could be in lots of areas like that. And the other thing that I'll say is, I just like to keep life as simple and true and honest as possible. And if my basic needs are being met, which we can talk about later, then I'm happy. And I just want to be happy.
So I mean, I think that there's so many different like I look at you as like if you were delivering like packages through the internet, like there's so many different packages that come from you from so many different directions. So I want to start with like now. I want you to talk about like the product that you have. I want you to talk about the meaning of that actual title of that product and what are you using that for right now?
Okay, that's a great place to start. Right now, where are we at? So I am the CEO of Uchi, a company. It's a social app that I created. It actually started back in 2001 as a website, before Facebook, before MySpace, as a social platform, not a social media. And Uchi is a Japanese word. It's spelled UCHI. And there's a Japanese concept called Uchi Soto. And Uchi means in-group, and Soto means out-group. And what I've learned over the last 22 years of digging into human behavior and emotional health is that when we feel connected to our in-group, to the people that are closest to us, that's what makes us happy. And happy people do good things. Hurt people will hurt people, including themselves. And we know from the research that the happier we are, the better our behaviors are. And happiness comes from connection and relationships. So Uchi is a social platform that helps people connect with those closest to them. But your Uchi is dynamic, and there can be several different Uchis. You can have an Uchi of friends, of family, your coworkers can be an Uchi. And it's a dynamic relationship too, because if you're Uchi at work, let's say you're in the engineering department at work, then that's your Uchi, and the marketing department, the finance department, they're Soto to you. But if you're talking to a client, a customer, then your whole company is your Uchi, and the client or the customer is Soto. So it's a dynamic relationship in that way. But Uchi is a social app that helps you connect with the people closest to you. And the more connected we are, the happier we are. And the happier we are, the better our behaviors.
So, I mean, I think that everything that we're going to be talking about has a duality. And, we started off talking about you being in a circle and kind of going into the etymology of Uchi. That's one of the definitions of that word, right? It's about being in an inner circle. And that's what I'm saying, like with the duality, you're talking about being in a circle individual, which in networking, it's communication, is building, is trust. But at the same time, what does that inner circle look like in a person's behavior, which is something else that you also talk about? So I want you to kind of like dive into why did you pick that name? I mean, it's obvious to me, but to a regular listener that's listening to Uchi, Japanese, inner circle, what the hell does that have to do with anything? And I want you to kind of tell us your thought process of how you came up with that name.
Okay, right on, right on. So the original name of the company, of the application, was something totally different, and I rebranded in 2019, and that's when I came up with the word Uchi. And what I've learned over the last 22 years, digging in, I mean, I'm digging deep into human behavior. What I learned, in short, is that when a person feels more connected, their behavior improves. So I found research, this is like back in the 90s and before, I found research that showed when a person who's struggling with alcohol abuse, when they feel more connected, their alcohol abuse improves. Then there's research showing if a person's struggling with drug addiction, when they feel more connected, their drug addiction improves. I found research showing someone who's suffering from an eating disorder, when they feel more connected, their eating disorder improves. And that's anorexia and bulimia, and that's obesity. You know, how many people eat their feelings, you know? So it goes on and on from from subject matter or industry to industry. But what I see happening is the industries aren't talking to each other. For example, the people who are researching alcohol abuse in veterans between the ages of 35 and 55 are not talking to the people who are studying eating disorders in 13 to 15-year-old teenage girls. And the industries aren't talking to each other. So we're all like really siloed. You know, we're in our little Uchi, right? And we're not cross-pollinating. So one of the nice things about the Uchi platform, now this could be getting a little bit all over the place, but the thing about the Uchi platform is you have your Uchi and I have my Uchi, but one or two people in our Uchis could overlap. And then their Uchi overlaps with a few people in someone else's Uchi. So you get this really nice branching. And when each Uchi overlaps, that's when connection really spreads out. And the more connected we feel, the better our behaviors. And like I was saying about the research, it's all there. The research is there. And I'll go out on a limb and say, I don't think humanity has a mental health problem. I don't think that's what our problem is. I don't think we're in a mental health crisis. I think we are in an emotional health crisis, and there's a difference. And too often, even the industry, they lump or they group emotional health as part of mental health. I completely separate the two. Now, don't get me wrong, they do interrelate, right? Physical health impacts mental health, mental impacts emotional, emotional impacts spiritual, and so on. But they're different. The way you nurture your physical health is different than the way you nurture your emotional health. And we are not nurturing each other emotionally. Our frontal lobe, our brain can think quite clearly. We can do our homework, we can do our jobs. That's our frontal lobe reasoning and deciding and thinking. But where most of our behaviors actually come from is our midbrain and our amygdala. And that's where our emotions are rooted. And if we don't address the midbrain and our emotional health, which I define as our ability to give and receive love, connection, a sense of belonging, if we don't nurture that, then we really have very little chance of engaging our frontal lobe and our mental capacity. So basically, you're either in a thinking and reasoning state or an emotional state. And we also know from the neuroscience that 95% of our actions and behaviors come from our subconscious and our emotional state. That engages orders of magnitude faster than our reasoning and frontal lobe. So if we don't address the more basic need in our midbrain, our emotional state, our need for love and connection, then we're in pain. And a person in pain will do anything to ease their pain. And in the absence of knowing how to love and connect, we turn to those behaviors to try and make ourselves feel better. We drink to numb, we eat to soothe, we love, we try to like have sex to feel, but it doesn't solve the root problem of really feeling like you matter and you're valued by somebody else.
I think that's a hell of a definition, and it's a segue to an article that you wrote probably 4 years ago on your blog. And the title of the article was "4 Common Ways We Destroy Connection and Damage Emotional Health." And in that article, you were talking about shame, judgment, neglect, and rejection. So I think what you just talked about kind of is stemming from that article. Believe it or not, I think like through osmosis, you're talking about that article. So I want you to kind of talk about those 4 different things and how those things all work to help be for someone to overcome them through using the Uchi platform.
Yeah, absolutely. And wow, thank you for bringing that up, because to me, what you just shared there from the article are little t traumas. We hear about trauma all the time, and trauma is terrible. And we don't want anyone to have trauma, right? And they often get classified as ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And they're horrible. I mean, this is like sexual abuse, physical abuse, growing up in a home with an alcoholic father or mother, or family of divorce. Those are big T traumas. And if you have just one, then you're probably going to struggle in life with a quote mental health problem. But if you have 3 or more, you have like, I don't know the number exactly, but if you have 3 or more ACEs, you've got like a 90% chance that you're going to be in prison. It's not because you decided to commit a crime. You're just trying to ease your pain or meet a basic need, like getting food or something. But it's the little t traumas that we just minimize or completely dismiss. And there's many, but I've landed on the 4, which is shame, judgment, degradation, or emotional neglect. And emotional neglect shows up as something like, I lost my hat when I was a little boy and I was really upset about it and I was crying. And my mom's like, "Why are you crying about that hat? We'll get you a new one. It's no big deal." She was dismissing my feelings. She said to me, this is actually a true story. So she said to me, "I don't want to hear you cry. If you want to cry, then just go up in your room and cry, because I don't want to hear it." That's emotional neglect. My feelings are not validated. My feelings are not even okay to have. And when we grow up in environments of shame and judgment and not allowing ourselves to express our feelings, that hurts. That causes pain. It causes stress. Our cortisols rise. And when we have cortisol pumping through our body all the time, you know what it does to our brain chemistry? It changes our brain chemistry. Now we wonder why people's brain chemistry is off and they're getting depression at age 3 or some other problem. Now, I'm not saying brain chemistry, isn't real. It's completely real. But why is it happening? Why is it happening across any demographic? And I'll even go a step further. You're Black, I'm white. Okay, obvious. Well, if you're a Black person in America, you're already devalued as a human. We don't value Black people as much as white people. We value men over women. We value Christian over Jew. We value Jew over Muslim, or Muslim over atheist, right? There's this whole hierarchy. But just a Black person, I have enough Black friends that I've had these conversations. Just being a Black person walking out of your home, it's unsafe. It could be threatening just being in the environment of the United States or elsewhere, but let's just say US for now. It raises your stress level. It raises your cortisol, right? Now your immune system has to deal with that. So it's no wonder to me why Black people suffer from more blood pressure problems, cardiovascular problems, diabetes problems. Their system is already immune compromised just because of the environment that they live in, that they are less valuable. They are less lovable than, say, a white person. So, I understand access to healthcare and everything, and that's all really important. Don't get me wrong. But just being Black in the United States, especially depending on what part of the country you live in, just walking out of your house is extra stressful, and that's an attack on your immune system. So I'll stop there before I talk about Uchi some more.
Well, obviously, as a host, I could pull it back together, right? So, obviously, that's a serious topic that most people are either well aware of, obviously myself, right? Or they kind of ignore it. And I think it still goes back to your article, because in your article, there was a segment that you were talking about, what do we really fear? And so everything that you're compiling and talking about is essentially fear of something, right? Whether it's judgment or whether it's being shamed or whether it's neglect, or to your case of your example, a Black person stepping outside of their house in particular areas of the US, and they have fear of that. And then that causes the chemical reaction, which causes their brain to change. And also, you know, if you're thinking about something so much that you're being stressed out, then you end up with hypertension. So I want you to talk about like, how does Uchi help with people overcoming fear by utilizing connection?
Absolutely. I love that. So, yes, fear. Roosevelt wasn't right when he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Mm.
What are we actually fearing? And sometimes we're fearing for our lives, our physical existence. But so often, I think even more often on a daily basis, we're fearing the shame and judgment and degradation, emotional neglect. And when we don't have a chance as a human being, when we don't have a chance to share our perspective and be heard and be understood, then we don't feel like we even matter. We don't feel like we have value. And value translates to love in our brain. And again, love is a basic human need. So with the Uchi platform, it's so simple. It's just so simple. All you need to do on the Uchi platform is share your answers to questions on the platform. Now you have a chance to share your perspective and be heard by your Uchi, right? The people who matter most to you, the people you're closest to. Because who cares if somebody in Iowa, listens to what you say? If your father or mother, if your child or spouse are not listening to you and you don't feel heard by them, it hurts. And that causes pain. And then we react with our behaviors, get into arguments and conflicts and so on. So with the Uchi app, we've got questions all over the place. They cover all manner of topic, but we avoid the controversial stuff. We avoid the political stuff. It's really just about going just below surface level conversation, right? It's the kind of things that don't come up when you interrogate your child when they come home from school. How was school? What'd you do? What'd you learn? What's your homework? And on the flip side, with Uchi, well, the two main rules of Uchi are you can only read answers from your friends on Uchi, and you can only read their answer if you've already answered that question. So you have to contribute in order to consume, right? That's the opposite of any social platform out there where you can just consume and never offer anything. Well, how are you actually going to have a connection if both parties aren't sharing? Right? You can't,
Yeah.
So with Uchi, both parties are sharing. And just like that example, when a child comes home from school, they get interrogated by their parent and the child just shuts down, right? How was school? Fine. What'd you do? Nothing. When does the parent ever share how their day was? I mean, this is what family dinner used to be kind of about, like in the 70s or before. But even then, it was typically a one-way dialogue, the parents interrogating the children. But when does the parent ever share how their day was? My dad never came home from work and was like, oh, I gave this big presentation at work and it didn't go so well and my boss isn't happy and I'm not sure what's going to happen and now I got to redo it and he's really got to. My dad never shared anything like that. It's always, what about the kid? But if the parents don't share or the teacher doesn't share, if the boss doesn't contribute, then how can you have a connection? And how are both parties feeling heard and understood? And again, when we're not heard and understood, we don't feel valued. Value translates to love. Love is a basic need. And without that, we're in pain. And we're going to do anything to ease our pain.
I think the fact that you ended on that statement kind of leads me to who you are outside of the professional world, right? Because again, obviously, I think there's always a duality to a person. That like there's the person that's the perception, and then there's also what that person lives to do. And I think for you, your statement about happy people do good things, right? Hurt people and hurt themselves. But ideally, conquering fear, which is something that you do on a regular basis. Like you're an Ironman triathlete, right? You're a ballroom, award-winning ballroom dancer, right? You're a climber, and there's backpacking and then there's solo backpacking, which is two different monsters. So I want you to kind of talk about how have you grown into becoming the fearless individual to overcome and make all these different achievements while helping people find their journeys at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, something that I've said for a while now is that I believe completely is the more extreme the behavior, the deeper the emotional pain.
Mm,
And I've done some pretty extreme behaviors in my own life. And it took me a while to realize this because I was having so much fun with all these constructive behaviors, right? The destructive behaviors are easy. Heroin, addiction, alcohol abuse, beating up your spouse, those are easy to see destructive behaviors. But the other side of the coin is the extremely constructive behaviors. This is where you get to like the elite athletes, the actors,
mhm,
the politicians, and even me. So we'll just use me as an example, and I'll just cut to the chase. It took me at least 15 years to realize that, my passion for triathlon, because I've been a athlete, for 22 years, my passion for triathlon, when I really dug into it, that's how I was avoiding my own emotional pain. I would exercise so much and I loved it. I loved the training. It was fun and swimming and biking and running. I loved the training, but I was so tired, physically tired by the end of each day, there was no way I had any energy to sit and be and explore my emotional pain, you
mhm.
know? Now I don't have any of the classic aces, right? I didn't, my parents are still married at 60 years. Um, and I didn't have the classic adverse childhood experiences, but I was raised in an environment of constant judgment, constant criticism, and constant emotional neglect. My feelings were never valid or even acknowledged, and no matter what I did, it wasn't good enough. Now, my parents weren't like hard asses, like um, I wouldn't get like punished for a low grade, but they'd say something like, "Well, we know you got a B on that, but if you did what we said, you would have gotten an A." You
Mm,
know, if so it was this constant judgment. So I was never good enough. So for me, a lot of my life, a lot of my career has really been about trying to. I mean, this isn't really fun or easy to say, but this is the reality. Most of like all of my accomplishments are about me trying to prove my value to the world
mhm,
so that I'll be loved. That's where 80 patents come from. That's where triathlon for so many years comes from. Now, again, I liked it. It's
mm,
fun. My patents have saved hundreds of thousands of lives and made billions of dollars in revenue. So it's constructive behavior, but it's extreme.
mhm.
What am I trying to address? And you can look at people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates and and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. Their behaviors are horrible. Steve Jobs, their behaviors are horrible. They do great things in their
Mhm.
industry, but their personal lives are horrible, and they're constantly overcompensating for their emotional pain.
Hmm.
And that's where a lot of my accomplishments, but I love them and it's fun. It's fun to challenge yourself and push yourself and see what you can do. Backpacking on the northern slope of Alaska just with two other guys, self-guided, middle of no, and I mean nowhere. I mean, there's not even any trails where we were, like there's nothing out there, it's exciting and it's fun and it's like, wow, I'm really capable of a lot. I can learn a lot. I can do a lot. We humans are pretty amazing creatures. And when you've got support, it's you can do amazing things, right? It's like when you're falling in love, you feel like you can do anything. And if you don't have that, like if you get dumped by your, significant other, it's devastating. And you'll go without food and water and sleep for a couple of days or something.
So I think, I mean, obviously you brought up your adolescence and your younger days, and you were talking about like not necessarily being neglected, but having like the emotional distress, right? So I
Hmm.
want you to kind of talk about that a little bit deeper, and I want you to start this conversation off with identifying with 3 to 5 words that describes you today.
Oh, that describes me today.
Yep.
I would say balanced, simple, or simplistic view. Um, now I'm stuck. um, it's so funny, simple, but also serious.
Mhm.
And I'm also going to say frustrated.
Mm.
I am definitely frustrated. Is that enough? That's like 4 or
Yeah. So I mean, let's say, I mean, obviously you're a scientist, right? So that's the control, right? So
Mhm.
let's talk about this versus you as a child. How would you identify if you were to time travel back and you were in that kid, you're sitting down and you're feeling probably stifled, a little bit neglected. How would you identify then?
Yeah, definitely like I did not feel heard. I did not feel understood. Felt minimized.
Mm,
Um, felt like I didn't matter.
mm,
You know, what I said didn't matter. What I had to share and offer didn't matter because either my older siblings or definitely my parents always knew better. And that's not true, but that's what I felt and that's what I believed. Um, and then that actually led to strong feelings that I won't ever be loved. I
So,
only realized that as an adult, but that's
mhm.
how I felt as a kid.
So how does that ball of negative energy then become more so? I mean, I think your first area of expertise was biomedical engineering.
Mhm. Mhm.
So how does an individual that's stifled and feeling neglected, and obviously, there's negative and there's positive energy. So you're like building up, and then of all the things you can get into was biomedical. Like how
Right.
how did that happen?
Yeah. So it's some of it is the classic, what do my parents value or what does society value? Because again, value equals love. And this is all subconscious, right? But what do we value or what do people value and how will I be valued? And I wanted to be a doctor, you know. Of course, no one ever grows up and no one's ever a child and says, I want to be a drug addict when I grow up. Um, right. But I wanted to be a doctor, you know, that's revered in society, right? And I like the science and I like the math, and I was good at the math and science, not as much as at the English type stuff. Um, and my dad, very mechanical, very hands-on. He wanted to be an architect, but the math wasn't working for him, so he went into psychology and law. So he was an attorney his whole life. But throughout my whole childhood, I was my father's little helper.
Mm,
So we would, I mean, we'd fix the lawnmower, the dishwasher, we would build tables, and we restored a 1968 Mustang convertible. We built a garage on the house. We added a sunroom to the house. Like we were always doing projects and I was always his little helper. And he loved the math and science. He definitely recommended engineering. I started in mechanical, which is a nice broad base. I've always been fascinated by the human body and like just the machine of the human body and how
mhm,
that works. So biomedical became a very natural um, um, direction for me, and that's I got my master's in biomedical engineering, and it was all like solving problems because that's what my dad and I did for 18 years growing up. We were just solving problems, you
mhm,
know, and just taking all of that forward. You know, you learn, you know, the math and the science and everything in school, sort of the theory behind everything, but it really was all of that background based knowledge and that belief that we can solve any problem or design anything that we want to design. And that's really what I took to
mm,
my career and how I've been able to design and solve problems so prolifically because that's my belief system. I know we can solve it no matter what it is. We'll solve it. And I had a boss um, in the middle of my career, I had a boss, and we were doing this is when we were doing a lot of the behavior modification research, and I was writing a lot of software at the
mm,
time and designing these little sensors, you know, just from stuff we'd find at Home Depot and Radio Shack and that kind of thing. And I was so stuck. I've been working on this problem for like 3 days, and I was like, I cannot figure this out. And I went to my boss. I'm like, I can't figure this out. Like, I've been working on this. I don't know what to do. I'm totally stuck. And he says to me, he's like, "Oh, you'll figure it out." And that was it. And I'm like, "Are you kidding me? Like, that is not helping me at all." But what it did do is my boss believed in me. And knowing that he believed in me I could believe in myself. And learning all that stuff from my dad, and I knew that we could solve problems, that combination of them believing that we can solve problems and my boss believing in me, I solved the problem. You know, like a day later, I solved the problem. You can always solve the problem. You just got to dig down. You got to simplify it down. This is what I've learned anyway. You simplify it down to the bare roots. And what I've learned time and again is when you can identify the true root problem, the solutions are surprisingly simple. And that's why I say the mental health industry is just following the wrong paradigm and the wrong premise. And that's why they haven't solved any of these problems, to be perfectly honest with you. And that's why we need to shift to the emotional health and relationships and connection. And that's what has to be nurtured.
From a scientific standpoint, I think like the theory that you're stating is definitely a phenomenal one. But I think going back to what you said about Elon Musk and like, you know, all these founders of these large corporations, multi-billionaires, they're essentially overachievers. And based upon what you said, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong, I see you as being an overachiever. And one example of that is, yes, you figure out the problem and then you cause the solution, or you create the solution in something that you got from your dad about figuring out something and then building the solution for it. So I'm answering the question, but I want you to kind of tell a story about most people. They may have 1, maybe 3, maybe 5 patents. How the living hell did you get to 80 patents?
It's the overachieving. I mean, you really hit the nail on the head with that. You know, my overachieving is my way of trying to feel valued in the world, and value equals love. So I was in a really great environment. Most of my patents are at one company. A few patents from that company where I talked about that boss is named Steve Lane. You know, shout out to Steve Lane. But most of the patents are from another company, K2M, which is now Stryker, which is Stryker's orthopedic implants and a whole bunch of other stuff. But K2M was just spinal implants. And I was in an environment where I pretty much had free reign. I mean, I would go a couple weeks without talking to my boss, and I could just, you know, I would just identify problems. I talk to surgeons, talk to nurses, talk to scrub techs, not patients. That's what the clinicians do, but talking to the healthcare providers and say, you know, what are you struggling with? You know, what do you need help with? And I remember one day, and this is in my book, which is called Innovate the 1%, about how to innovate. I remember one day I was in the OR observing a pretty basic spine surgery, and we got to the point where the spinal rod is being put into the person's back. It's like the last step of the surgery. You put a bunch of screws in the bones of the spine, and then you put a rod. You put 2 rods in, and you know it was long, so they had to cut the rod to length. And there's a rod cutter, and they took out the rod cutter, and they go to cut the rod, and the rod cutter failed. Like it wouldn't cut the rod. This is like so simple stuff, right? It's a metal rod. So they're like, all right, go get another rod cutter. So they open up another instrument set, which now they break that sterile field. So they got to re-sterilize that and reprocess it and everything, which is a real pain. It took a few minutes to do this. They got another rod cutter. Meanwhile, now the patient is under anesthesia even longer, which is not good. The longer you're under anesthesia, the worse it is for the patient outcome. So they get another rod cutter, and then that one jammed and it didn't work. So finally, they're like, well, just get the bolt cutters. And when I mean bolt cutters, this is the stuff that you find in a machine shop. You know, these are like, you know, 2 feet long, and it weighs like 7 pounds of solid steel to cut a metal rod. And they did that, and it was actually, the rod was already in place in the spine, and they cut it, and the shock wave that goes through, I'm like, oh my God, like, what is this doing to the patient? But that's all they had. That's the last ditch effort, is to use a pair of bolt cutters, you know? So I go back to my team the next day, and I'm like, you guys, we just added an extra like 15, 20 minutes to what should have been like a 45-minute surgery. We added another 15, 20 minutes. We got to solve this problem. I mean, this is absurd, you know? And oh my God, the next day, my designer came in And he's like, Kevin, check this out. He brought in this little bitty pipe cutter, like used for plumbing, and he put it on a rod and he spun it around. He dialed it, spun it, spun it. And he took a pair of Insight 2 rod benders. It's just a standard instrument in any instrument set for the spine to bend a rod when it's in place. And he just squeezed it real quick and it snapped perfectly. And there was no sharp edge. When you cut a rod with a bolt cutter, it pinches it and you get a really sharp point to it. But that's all. I mean, God, what's that going to do inside the body? But with the pipe cutter, perfectly pristine edge with minimal effort. It was unbelievable. So that's how things come up. You identify problems, you talk to your team, someone has an idea, they pull on some other area, just like what I talked about earlier. The people who are working on drug addiction aren't talking to the people working on eating disorders, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We pull things from just, what Home Depot and Lowe's, what they have in their hardware section. Or I came up with another idea. Actually, I'll do a little show and tell. The team was having trouble with this patent that we had purchased from somewhere else, and they couldn't get the implant to work. It just was, I won't go into the long story, but it wasn't working. And they're like, hey, Kevin, can you just take a look at this? I'd only been at the office for 3 days. And they're like, hey, can you take a look at it? So I take a look at it. And the problem is the screw that goes into the bones of the spine, the vertebra, the screw gets buried in, and then you can't get the instrument to lock the screw to the rod. You can't get it in there because the instrument needs so much force. It has to be really bulky, and you can't get in there with the anatomy. So I look at it and I'm like, all right, so we need to move it out. And I had this memory of my mom's potted plant hanging in our kitchen. So it's a hanging potted plant. And the plant container, the pot had a little lip on it. And there were these 3 little fake plastic cords that came down and grabbed underneath the lip, like little hooks under the lip. I'm like, oh, why don't we just make a little lip at the top of this screw? And that will move where we attach the instrument about 10 millimeters outside of the wound, so away from the anatomy. And that's what turned into this implant, which I'll hold it up to the screen. You see this little lip right above my finger? That little lip we added because it wasn't there. It was just smooth before. We added this little lip. I figured out with my engineering, I figured out how big does the lip need to be to withstand the force and everything like that. And the next day, another designer came back with this beautiful bowl shape and put the lip on it, just as I described it. And from that point, the entire project took off. The instruments were really sleek. They were outside the wound, or they weren't right up against the anatomy, really. And as of October of 2020, this screw has been implanted more than 1 million times in a person somewhere in the world because we got that lip on it so we could attach an instrument. And that came from a potted plant in my mom's kitchen.
Yes, I mean, what I'm hearing, it's been a long time since I've heard someone define what you're defining, and I've been through those moments as well. So, and again, you can correct me if I'm right or wrong, but I see that you're 50% analytical and 50% creative. Like you're split down the middle, like literally, and like that's the way I operate. Like a lot of times, perception may be like a lot's going on, and this dude is scattered and he's all over the place, but in reality, there's interconnecting. It's kind of like a black hole, and you're folding time on itself and getting those 2 points together. And I think
it all fits together.
It all makes sense. Like once your brain is working on both hemispheres, things that seem to be weird and crazy, like a pot, works perfectly well when you're coming into helping someone that's on a actual surgery, right? So again, I think
that's why I said balance, right? That's why I said balance, because I balance my right and left brain. I balance my physical health, all that triathlon and backpacking, with my mental health, all this, hard thinking, designing, with my emotional health, having all my connections. I mean, I've got best friends since kindergarten. I've got really strong connections. And even though I have, challenges with my parents, I'm telling you, when we use the Uchi app, when we're regularly using it, arguments like completely. We don't argue. Like we never argue when we're using Uchi.
So I mean that's phenomenal, and the fact that your brain is always it's like a wave meter, right? It's always up and down, but it's equaling out by the end result. I want you to talk about like the journey of where you are. How long did it take you to get to the point to where you are right now? And I'm not talking about from like childhood. I'm talking about from once you decided to get into engineering until today.
Okay, so engineering was in late high school because I went to college for engineering, and that was wonderful. And I went right from undergrad to graduate, so I went right to biomedical, and then I got a great job designing total joint replacements, right? And that's been my career. But it was during that behavior modification research era, when with the boss that's like, "Oh, you'll figure it out." He said it so nonchalantly, it was like drive me crazy. We were doing all this behavior modification research, and at the same time I was like struggling with my dating life. I was like, why do I keep like, it's not going well, and I keep dating these women with low self-esteem and all that kind of stuff. And that's when in 2001, it was December of 2001, when I had this epiphany, because I was watching an argument between a father and his teenage daughter, and they're just butting heads and butting heads. And I'm like, if you would just say how you really feel or what you're really thinking, you would have no argument. So I subconsciously knew that the arguments were because people weren't really sharing and hearing each other. They weren't understanding each other. They didn't know each other's perspective. And that's in December of 2001 when the idea for Uchi first came about. But then, it's always been a side project, or for many years it was a side project. But I've always been constantly going down this rabbit hole of human behavior and peeling my own onion layers back. And it took me 15 years to realize that the reason I created Uchi, while it seemed like it was because of the argument between the father and his daughter, I really created Uchi because I needed to feel heard and understood by my parents. It took me 15 years to figure that out. The same thing with triathlon, where I started doing triathlon, ironically, 2001. By the way, I went to that Alaska backpacking trip in 2001. 2001 was a very big year for Kevin. I mean, hands down, huge year for Kevin. So with all the triathlon, it took me to like right after COVID, 2020, to really realize that triathlon was my way of avoiding my own emotional pain with exercise. And the reason it happened in 2020 is because, when everything's really shut down the first few months and we really couldn't do anything, I wasn't really doing much of anything, and I wasn't even exercising at the time. And by not exercising, that's when I realized that even a 30-minute run was enough to tire me out physically so that I wouldn't go anywhere emotionally. A 30-minute run. And I'm an Ironman, but an hour-long walk, that was fine, and I could still, go into my emotions or access that kind of stuff. So that's been this evolution and balancing and asking myself the hard questions and doing lots of journaling and like, why this and why that? And why do I do this behavior? Why do I do that behavior? And all that overachieving. I could have gone down the drug and alcohol route, but I went to the extremely constructive route of behavior to ease my pain. So that's kind of how it came together and evolved, and putting everything together from all different areas, because that's how I solve problems. Just wherever I can find a solution, it can come from anywhere.
I think it's a phenomenal like outlook of looking at things, negative versus positive, and I think it goes back to, it was a quote or something that was on one of your pages from the athletes that you deal with, and they always say that they surpass what they could have imagined, and you're a living example of that surpassing. So I want you to think about if time travel is possible, right?
Oh, I love thinking about time travel.
And you can go back in time, and again, you can go back anywhere, right? You can even go back before you were born. How far back would you go into your life? And if you could have a conversation with either yourself or someone to help your outcome be a little bit different or to happen a lot faster, who and what and where would you go, and what would you say?
Yeah. It basically, because we're talking about my life, so you put that qualifier, where in my life would I go? And I think for me, it comes back to somewhere like when I'm about 7 years old.
Mhm.
And I would tell myself to trust yourself, trust your intuition, trust your gut, and you matter.
Hmm. Yeah.
You're loved. That's what I would, because I think 7-year-old Kevin didn't feel like that. And he was taught to not trust his gut. He was
Hmm.
taught that it's only about the data, or it's only what you can see. And it's not what you can feel, you know. And just to let little Kevin know that whatever he has to share or say, it matters and he matters.
All right, so let's play off of that. I mean, obviously, you're stating that you'll go back to when you were 7, and you would tell yourself that you matter. But at the same time, I think based upon the both parents that you spoke about so far, I think that there was a push and pull. There was a negative and positive connection with your dad. So I
Mhm.
want to know, like, was he kind of like the pinnacle entrepreneur that kind of helped you jumpstart for you to become more of a business savvy individual? Or was it someone else that was around back then that helped influence you to become who you are?
I think on the business savvy side of things, it wouldn't be my parents. It's that, I don't believe anyone is 100% evil or 100% good.
Mhm.
So I got so many wonderful, great things from my mom and my dad, but I also got a lot of crap. Like it did, right? The criticism and judgment and everything. Um, you know, I didn't set out to want to be an entrepreneur. I didn't set out to want to have my own company, but I saw a problem. I had a solution. No one else was doing it, and I felt the responsibility to do it.
Mhm.
And well, so I guess I probably learned a lot of that from my parents, responsibility. I mean, I've been working since I was 14 years old.
Mhm.
I had like my own lawn cutting business, when I was 14, because my parents didn't just give us money to do whatever. Like we had to earn our money. I didn't get an allowance either. So we had to do chores around the house just because we were part of the family. Um, and and I was working since I was 14, so I had money to do whatever. Now I always had like clothes and if I wanted to go to a movie, my parents, but I had birthday money too, and I would always save my birthday money and everything. So um so looking back and going around in that little circle, I learned the work ethic and the responsibility from my parents. They're always been hard workers. They're always get stuff done kind of people. And for me and my business and Uchi, um, I saw a need. No one else is doing it. The problem is continues to not be solved, and we're struggling. And
Mhm.
I don't. I oh my god, I just can't stand. It breaks my heart to see anyone in pain. It just breaks my heart. I don't ever want to see anyone in pain ever, ever.
Mhm.
And I think Uchi can help.
Wow. I think out of everything that you just said is not only is phenomenal, but it's one key thing that I want to bring up. You were talking about lawnmowers, right? And you were talking about how you were making money back then. So it makes perfect sense. Like when I was going through your Instagram page, there was a picture with you with a brand new electric lawnmower, and you had like
Oh,
the
that's
look on your face, like Christmas Day, like you open up a brand new present. So like when you answered that, I was just like, it made perfect sense. It all came to fruition at that moment when you said what you said about lawnmowers.
that is hilarious. Like you definitely did your research, man. That's hilarious. Because
Yeah.
I forgot about that until you mentioned. I was like, wait, I don't have an electric lawnmower. Like, oh, I do have an electric lawnmower.
Yes, you do. And
I do.
if you look at that picture, I can see 7-year-old
Yeah.
Kevin like, yes, I got my toy of choice. So
Yeah, that's so hilarious. I love that.
yeah.
That's funny.
So I mean, obviously you're intellectual, right? I mean, you've been talking about like theories and philosophies and the way things should be. You own like more patents than a human should own, right?
Yeah.
I want you to kind of talk about like the books, a book or two that you would like to recommend that helped you on your journey to becoming who you are.
Oh, that helped me on my journey? That's a harder one. But where I am now, can I answer that question?
Well, yeah, let's flip it. Let's flip it. What books are you reading now then?
Okay. Oh, you know what? I will give you one book from on the journey, actually. I'll give you one book for that, which is Atlas Shrugged. And that can be
Oh,
very controversial for people. But for me, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand tells an amazing story about, her philosophy and everything. But what it did for me is it really solidified that people should be compensated for what they bring to the world. Like, and it's basically, it's about fairness, in my opinion. That may not be how other people interpret the book and whatnot, but for me, it's about fairness, and people deserve to be compensated, not because they look a certain way or they got a grade on a test or what. With what you bring to the world,
mhm.
you deserve to be compensated for that. It's yours. You own it. You did it. You should be compensated whatever way you want. It could be financially. It could be some other way. You should be compensated. And that was pretty pivotal for me, which I read that in like 2010, I think I read that. So that was kind of a big book for me. But then going forward, I read a book recently called Hunt, Gather, Parent.
Hmm.
It's a new book. It only came out like last year or something, maybe the year before. And it's a parenting book. Full disclosure, I don't have children, right? But I read parenting books because they get into a lot of human behavior kind of stuff. And Hunt, Gather, Parent is like a whole different perspective on how to parent children. And the sad truth is that so many of the ways that we parent kids came from like the 1930s and 40s and like Dr. Spock and how physicians treated orphans in an orphanage. Like go to bed at the same time, put them in their room, let them cry themselves to sleep. That is the absolute opposite of what children need when they're first, toddlers and babies. So Hunt, Gather, Parent really was a wonderful book to share a different perspective on how to parent, how to raise kids, and how to, in my opinion, love and value your children for the individual and the unique energy in the universe that they are.
So like, let's talk about like your author as well. And your book, I think the fact that the key term in your book is the 1%. And I want you to kind of talk about like the definition of that book. What does that innovate the 1% really mean? And I want you to kind of identify the 7 areas to nurture for success.
Okay, absolutely. So Innovate the 1% comes from when I was working at K2M, I was responsible for accepting disclosures from outside parties, usually surgeons, right? A disclosure is an idea for an invention. And I was responsible for officially logging it. And then I would like go back with my team and we would determine if it's feasible and if we're going to do this project and so on. And of course, talk to marketing and so on. And in the 7, almost 8 years that I was at K2M, I accepted more than 400 disclosures from surgeons. And these are world-renowned surgeons. I mean, like amazing people. And only 4 of those 400 plus turned into marketed products. That's the 1%. Now, my team came up with a lot more than that. Now, of course, we're engineers and designers, and we're doing this day in and day out. All we're doing is solving problems. That's all we do. Surgeons are doing surgery and they're meeting patients and blah, blah, blah. But that's where the 1% comes from because they're only accessing like one of the 7 areas to nurture, But in the book, I talk about 7, which I can't even remember off the top of my head. But I have the table of contents right here in front of me, and I didn't know you were going to ask me this question. But I mean, do you want me to go through all the areas or?
I mean, just give it like a light overview because I mean, there's so much information to unpack.
Yeah, it's a lot. So, I mean, it's a short read. You can read the book in an afternoon, but basically, it starts out with you have to start with a problem. So often, what I see, especially in tech, is a solution in search of a problem. You got to identify the problem and then come up with a solution to solve that problem. Like AI, or not AI, but VR and all the virtual reality stuff and like the whole metaverse and everything. That's a solution in search of a problem. Just being able to flip through the anatomy, virtually in this like hand swiping with your goggles on, that's not ed tech. People have been doing just fine reading Grey's Anatomy and getting, or whatever the anatomy books, and doing cadaver studies. The VR, that's a solution in search of a problem. And I see this all the time. Like wearables for med devices, the wearables. I mean, it's starting to like change a little bit of behavior, but not really. Not really. Just having that extra data is not. So anyway, I can go on and on about that. But start with a real problem and really dial into the root problem and then solve that. Okay. You got to have a foundation of relationships. So this sounds really way out there, but what I've learned and why we've been so prolific is at our company, we loved each other. We loved working together. We loved bouncing ideas off each other. We loved poking holes in each other's ideas and being like, dude, that is garbage. That's never going to work. And be like, all right, you're right. That's not going to work. Move on. If you don't have relationships where you can poke holes, like I remember one time I was working on this idea. I had like a 75-minute commute to work. And I was working through this whole idea on my commute. I was like, oh my God, I figured it out. This is going to be amazing. I get to work. I don't even take my coat off. I just drop my lunch in my, bag on my desk. And I go to the whiteboard and I'm like, oh my God, Larry, my designer's name is Larry. I was like, you got to see this. And I drew out this really detailed diagram of this idea that I had. And he's like, it took me like 10 minutes to draw this out. And he's looking at it, he's like, but what about that part right there? How does that work to do this? And I'm like, oh my God, this totally doesn't work. Like this whole thing is garbage. I erased the whole whiteboard and we just go about our day. I was his boss and he pointed out my complete and utter blunder. Fine. I made a mistake. My idea sucked. Move on. And it's okay. If you don't have relationships like that, where you can offer up horrible ideas and not feel like you're a horrible person for doing it and not get judged and shamed, most organizations are not like that. Most schools are not like that.
Facts.
Right? So, that's another part. A couple other elements are you got to know your subject matter. Because I see a lot of people coming in, like in the spine world, they come up with an idea, but their idea is so elementary, like it's already been thought of 1,000 times before. Like you have to know your subject matter really, really well, or you're just going to be reinventing the wheel, right? On the flip side, I think you also, and I've heard other people like Warren Buffett and stuff like that, you need to be taking in so much other information so that you can pull from other areas and then combine it in all new ways, like the potted plant or the pipe cutter, right? Yep. So those examples are in the book. Another key area is, I call this chapter, it's chapter 5, called Glass Ceilings. We are operating on so many limiting beliefs constantly. Our belief systems are limiting. We don't believe we can figure it out. We don't believe there's something more to it. We bow down to authority. John Locke said, question authority, right? Question everything. If we don't question the status quo, if we don't think outside the box, if we don't believe that it's possible, it won't be possible. So your belief system is critical. Something else, this is a really, really fun one, is I call riding the brainwaves. Because, okay, so there would be times when Larry, my designer, again, he had an associate's degree and he was better than most of the product development engineers who had, college degrees. Because he was so creative in thinking and so great at design work, So he'd be in my office and drawing on the whiteboard. I actually had 2 whiteboards in my office, like big ones. We're talking like 4 by 7 feet long. And he'd be drawing, and I'm like falling asleep in my chair. I'm like, my head's bobbing, my eyes are closing, I'm falling asleep. But when you're in that half awake, half asleep state, your brain is in a theta wave pattern. So you're having a bridge between your subconscious and your conscious. And your subconscious is taking in orders of magnitude more information than what your conscious mind can ever possibly manage. So I might be falling asleep, as Larry's writing, and I come out of it and I'm like, oh, do this right here. You have it right there. Because I'm in that theta wave pattern where I'm half asleep and half awake. And if you can tap into that and tap into your subconscious basically has like all the answers, really. So that's riding the brain waves. And then the last thing I'll say is chapter 7, which is strike while the iron is hot. So that if ever you have an idea, just start running with it, because it's so, like, how often do we have a dream or we wake up at night like, oh my God, that's the best idea ever. I'm totally going to do that. Oh, I'll never forget this idea. This is so good. You wake up in the morning and like, what? Like, what? Like, how? What? I don't even know what I was thinking. I don't even know what topic I was thinking about,
Write that sucker down, man.
Right. So write it down and start working on it. One of the really, actually, the most of the 1%, ideas, the absolute hands down best one of the 4 was by a doctor who had an idea for a pedicle screw. That's the screw I showed you before. Pedicle is part of the vertebra of the spine. He had an idea for a screw-based retractor, and he had this idea while he was mountain biking. And he shared it with our company, disclosed it to our company, and it came to, this is before I was, at the company, but it came to my desk as a screw, not this one, but a pedicle screw and a tampon applicator. And they said, Kevin, this is supposed to be a screw-based retractor. Figure it out. So he remembered the idea, struck while the iron is hot. He shared it with the company, and we turned it into an industry-changing, minimally invasive spinal pedicle screw procedure. It changed the way minimally invasive spine surgery is done around the world, because we struck while the iron was hot with his idea while he was mountain biking. So, those are some of the things in the book. And if you cultivate and practice, anybody can do this, but you got to practice, right? You got to get used to it. You got to get into that state where you're always thinking this way, or you're always pulling from some other aspect of your life. And anybody can do this. I've just been doing it since I was working with my dad, for the first 18 years of my life, but anybody can do it. You just got to keep practicing. And the more you do it, the better you get.
I think it's phenomenal that you brought into like the half awake, half sleep theta stage. And I think it's very parallel to like white knuckle grip being fear and then the primal instinct kicking in. So I want you to kind of, with that comparison being on the table, I want you to go into words of wisdom for an entrepreneur that is facing that white knuckle, hey, I want to do something, but I'm fearful of the rejection. But much like you said, if they were in theta and they were reaching more into their primal side and they would just jump and take action and do it, what would that look like coming from you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question, because I even need to take this advice more. I've been struggling lately with my own limiting beliefs, so I got to take my own advice. The white knuckling aspect, this is what cracks me up about so many managers and senior management in companies, where they feel they're like, all right, we're going to have a brainstorming session on Tuesday from 2 to 4, and I want the team to come up with the next industry disruptive technology. I've never seen that happen. I've never seen it work like that. And that's the strike while the iron's hot, but that's also go with the flow and trust your gut and balance out your day. We white knuckle, we entrepreneurs, and look, I'm guilty of this too. I mean, I totally do this. I feel like if I'm not sitting at my computer for 8 hours a day, I'm not going to make it. But when I'm doing the best, just like when I mentioned 2001, when I'm backpacking, I did my first triathlon in 2001. I came up with the Uchi concept and tapped into connection and emotional health in 2001, it's because my mind was free. I was letting my brain take breaks. I was tapping into my subconscious. I was experiencing so many different things at the same time. And then I was able to let my subconscious pull it together, bridge to my conscious, and make it happen. We got to take breaks. We got to balance our health. Brain breaks. I wrote a whole article about taking brain breaks, and that is your mental health. Your brain needs to rest, just like your body needs to rest, right?
Yeah.
If you don't give your brain a rest, if you white knuckle through the day and work those, I mean, there's so much research showing that like when you get to 8 hours, when you get to 9 hours of work, the likelihood of mistakes increases so much. And you get to 10 hours, it's like exponential how many more mistakes and how much less effective or quality of work drops immensely when you get to 9 and 10 hours of a workday. So my advice to entrepreneurs is trust yourself, trust your gut, stick with the fundamentals, keep things basic, meet the needs of your customer, solve that problem effectively. It doesn't have to have all the bells and whistles, but solve the problem that the customers are having or that your customers are having, and keep it simple.
So with that, the listeners listening, they're taking heed to what you said. How does someone get in contact with you?
Well, it's pretty easy because if you search Kevin R. Strauss, I'm all over the place, and you'll find my patents and publications and book and whatever. My website is kevinrstrauss.com. Uchi's website is uchiconnection.com. And LinkedIn is the social platform that I use more than anything. And I'm starting to get my YouTube channel going, which is Kevin R. Strauss. So everything's pretty much Kevin R. Strauss. And I'd love to hear from you. I want to connect. We could even do a Uchi Tribe after this as a follow-up to this pod or to this episode where, we do a raffle, put your name in, we'll draw 8 names and we'll get into a deeper conversation. You and I can come up with like 10 questions based on this podcast episode. And let's get into some real conversation with the listeners of the podcast.
I think that's a hell of a way to kind of define the case study, because the Uchi app is not just for individual connections. You kind of branched out into podcast connections as well too. So like just talk about like that feature set and what's the core principle of that aspect of the app.
Yeah. So, Uchi's all about connecting people and having real relationships, real connections, real conversation. And, one of the biggest problems that I've seen and I've read about for podcasts is engaging your audience. There's no, how many people are downloading and what country or state they're downloading from, but you don't have direct interaction. And I believe there are a lot of listeners, not all listeners, but a lot of listeners want to have more direct connection with the host or the guest. But where do you begin? I could just reach out into the air and be like, hey, I loved your podcast. Now what? Right. But with Uchi, we can come up with some specific questions that are episode specific, and let's engage in the conversation. And then we can ask follow-up questions, and it's all completely private. The only people who have access to this asynchronous conversation are the people in the tribe. It's a way for hosts and guests to connect directly in real conversation with the listeners and vice versa. So that's Uchi right there.
So, I mean, the key word of this entire episode has been connection, connection, connection over and over again. So this next question is kind of going into like some bonus questions that I have. And as I always say, this is my signature question. But for you, I can't really put my finger on which direction you're going to go with the answer. So if you could connect for 24 hours with any person, that person could be dead or alive in any time frame in history, who would it be and why?
I mean, there's a bunch of people.
You have one choice.
One, really?
One.
One.
That's going to make that choice so much more impactful because, again, you have to kind of filter the multiple options.
I mean, there's there because there's so many wonderful people out there. But I think for me, I would love to sit down and connect with Oprah.
I can see that.
Right. She's got the reach. She's got the wisdom. She's got the heart.
She's an overachiever.
But look at her past.
Exactly.
Look at her childhood.
Exactly.
You know? Yeah. She gets it on such a deep level, and she knows how to put ideas into action, and she's got the reach and the influence people and the trust of so many people. And it's not just US stuff, right? And this is global, you know. I would love to we could do Super Soul Sunday or whatever else, but I would love to just work with her and change the world.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you said Oprah, because I can see if Oprah decided to run for president, hands down, period, she would win. Like, just period.
I think you're right on the money.
Absolutely. Like there's no I think the reason, kind of like going into politics a little bit without getting into politics, is like, I think part of Obama winning that race was her being part of that influence that you're talking about, to kind of amp him up to saying that he is going to be the first Black president. So I mean, I think to your point, Oprah is so influential for so many decades at this point in time. She can say and do anything to make change.
And she does make change. Yes, she does make change, and she's got the trust, but she's earned the trust over, like you said, so many decades. And I mean, you know, what can you say? So if anybody knows Oprah and can get me in touch with Oprah, if Oprah's listening to the show, you know, I'm easy to get a hold of. Let's sit down, and we're already changing the world with this podcast today.
Yeah.
Let's go big. I mean, literally, the Uchi's vision statement is a world at peace because every person truly believes they matter.
Yeah, so that's a hell of a brand statement. Like, I mean, I'm just breaking it down. It's a great statement for sure. I think, like, going back to Oprah, those that know me personally, like, this podcast, the theories and philosophies and the way I do my interviewing style, it's based upon what she's done. It's like living from her examples of being so intuitive and listening and regurgitating the content and questions. You really get to another level of in-depth interviews that is not an interview anymore. It goes way surpast that. Yeah,
I mean, you definitely got me sharing stuff that I do not typically share, you know, openly, publicly. So kudos to you for digging deep and doing your research too. Like, you dug into some stuff, because I don't really use Instagram, but you went to my Instagram page, you know, or my account or whatever they call it, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, you did your homework and you asked some good questions. You got me thinking.
Well, I definitely appreciate that. So, I mean, now that we're on that spectrum, I mean, going into closing of the podcast, I always like to give whoever I'm interviewing an opportunity, because we went over so many different things. Let's switch the character roles, right? The Boss Uncaged podcast is now yours. You're now the host, and I'm now your interviewee. Do you have any questions for me?
Oh my God, man, I should have prepared for that. I want to ask, like, I mean, you're overachiever too, you know, like, you're rocking it, you know, with the work that you do. What's keeping your drive going, or your motivation and drive?
Death is an inevitable thing that's going to happen. So for me, it's kind of like, I need to make sure that everything that I'm doing not only makes an impact, but it becomes longevity, because tomorrow could be my last day. And I've been down that road where I faced death before. So I understand the principles of, like, what you have to do, and you need to do it now, and the urgency for doing it now versus waiting to do it tomorrow.
And having that legacy for when you're gone.
Well, it's not necessarily. Originally, it was kind of like, when I thought about it, I was like, okay, legacy for your kids are great, but even still, your kids will eventually die, right? And if they're not taking legacy and pass it on to their kids, then how do I expand on that? So I look at it from the standpoint of what's the biggest legacy I could leave behind was entrepreneur to entrepreneur, right? If you're listening to this podcast and you share it to someone else, or someone is on this show and their kids are listening, well, now we're talking about multiplication, right? Now we're talking about at scale. So we're not just talking about my personal family, we're talking about entrepreneurs as a collective.
Right. So keeping that chain going, and the next, it's like domino, the next impacts the next, impacts the next.
Yep.
And if you can be a seed to get that started, and then it can go from there.
Yep. And that's why I love podcasting. And I mean, like, the questions that I ask are essentially evergreen questions. What we talked about today, your story is always going to be your story. We didn't date it. We didn't talk about current events. We talked about you and talked about how did you get to where you are. And your story could be someone that's being born 10 years from now, living in your shoes that you lived 20, 30, 40 years ago, that didn't even know that you were in existence until they heard this podcast. And now they're living based upon your examples, and it helps them move forward.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. Well, and that to me is legacy too, not just passing to your kids and their kids, but what you're putting out. And you've put out a lot of podcast episodes. You're putting out all this wonderful content that can reach so many more people, where they can do their best work and help more people, and so on.
Yep. Great. Any other questions?
I mean, I need to sit down, but maybe we'll come up with a few for the Uchi tribe.
Fair enough. Well, I definitely appreciate everything you brought to the table today. And we was talking off air about figuring out the synergy, and there's so many different branches to your story. But I would think that someone looking from the outside in, a depiction, I think we kind of got that synergy. We got that wave, the ups and downs, and the polars and the negatives. And who you are today is because of all these different elements that happened throughout your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really believe that about everybody. I mean, I don't think anybody is one-dimensional. We get so pigeonholed, but this is why actors can become president, or get into politics. Like you can't, you're not just an actor, you have other interests. These surgeons that I work with are flying airplanes and yacht racing. And, of course, I'm not doing that. I'm riding a bicycle, and they're buying, yachts. But, we're all multidimensional. And that's kind of a wonderful thing about each of us human beings. And, we're all valuable, unique energy in the world.
Very cool. Very cool. I have one last question before we close out. I mean, since you talked about biking a couple of different times, how was that bike tour in Atlanta?
The bike tour in Atlanta.
Yeah. So you got to dig deep. I forgot what page it was, either on your Facebook page or your Instagram page, but it was you and a friend of yours, and you did a 3-hour bike tour in Atlanta.
I can't, I'm not sure which one this is. But I do remember, and I might have posted this on Facebook. I went on a bike ride. It wasn't a tour per se, but a ride with a friend. His name's Kevin. And it was a 4-hour bike ride. We actually rode by Tyler Perry's house and his mom's house. Actually, we rode on that road, but didn't see him or anything, but whatever. And we had a 4-hour conversation. And I basically listened and gave him little nuggets based on my background and a lot of stuff that we talked about today about emotional health and connection, because he struggled with, well, I don't want to talk about his personal stuff, but he struggled with some things in his life that have really derailed his life in some pretty devastating ways. And I explained my approach and my understanding. And by the end of that 4-hour bike ride, he's like, Kevin, I've been in therapy for 5 years. We have never even come close to the insight and understanding and explanation that you gave me in this 4-hour bike ride. And then I suggested using Uchi. What was the website before that? And he's like, my dad is never going to use, there's no way my dad's ever going to use it. And I was like, well, if you can get him to try it, maybe he'll give it a go. And he's like, all right, I'll try it. And they started using it. He couldn't even keep up with his father. His father was answering so many questions and sharing things that he would never say to his son, my friend, in person. But in writing, that's the kind of sharing, the kind of connection And my friend, he's like, oh my God, we've been using this. And my dad is telling me stuff he's never said to me in my entire life. And he actually said that he is proud of me, but he's never said that before. But it came out through the writing in the platform.
I think that's a hell of a way to close out this episode. It's kind of like a live testimonial from the inner boss himself. So I definitely appreciate you being on the show today. I think you brought so much value, so much diversity, so much like so many different variables of context that we talked about. It was just a great conversation.
We're all over the place, but you brought it all together. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate it.